Okay, this is your test review on the age of Jackson. Remember your essential questions. First, how did Jackson's administration affect the spread of popular sovereignty? Two, what were the long-term impacts of Andrew Jackson's policies toward Native Americans? And three, how did the Tariff of Abominations lead to the doctrine of nullification? Keep these things in mind, as well as the question of whether Andrew Jackson was a champion of the common man or if he acts as King Andrew or, in effect, as a tyrant. Okay, a little bit of background on Andrew Jackson. Remember that he's nicknamed Old Hickory for his toughness. He was a general during the War of 1812, winning a major battle in the Battle of New Orleans, which was technically after the war was over. But hey, a win's a win, right? And that he also leads several campaigns against Native American groups, particularly the Creek and the Seminole. So be mindful that Jackson is seen as this hero, and being that he has this nickname, he becomes very relatable to common citizens who are going to begin being allowed to vote. In the election of 1824, you have several candidates, and no one wins a clear majority. But in effect, it's pretty much going to come down to Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. All right, John Quincy Adams is obviously the son of President John Adams. He has strong support from New England. He's from that region anyway. And he very much is going to favor internal improvements in the United States. Some of those improvements are going to include the National Road, Erie Canal, things of that nature. All right, in the election of 1824, Jackson does receive the most popular votes, but he does not get the majority in the Electoral College. So with this election and the outcome, with Henry Clay, who was running for president as well, siding with Adams and getting the House of Representatives, who makes the decision once the Electoral College doesn't have a majority, he gets them to support Adams. And so then Adams is named the next president, despite the fact that Jackson had received more of the popular vote, or the vote of the people. Oh, that's a better slide than the one before. Sorry about that. Okay, so your result within this is first that Jackson is upset because he feels like he's been robbed, and he calls Adams' victory a corrupt bargain. And what he's meaning in that is Henry Clay supports Adams in the House of Representatives, pretty much gets everyone to steer towards him, and then Adams names Henry Clay the Secretary of State. To Jackson, that just sounds a little fishy. Something's not quite right there. And that's why he calls this a corrupt bargain. Okay. Within this election, Jackson is seen as a man of the people, and that's going to kind of bring support his way in the next election. He also supports removing property restrictions or qualifications for voting. Remember the establishment of the United States that you have to be a white male with property in order to vote. Many of your states are going to move away from that and have tax-paying qualifications or just universal white male suffrage. And you simply just have to be a white male in order to be able to vote. Be mindful during this time period, and we're talking about the 1820s, 1830s, African Americans, Native Americans, and women still do not have the right to vote. All right, fast forward 4 years later, and you have the election of 1828. John Quincy Adams is running for re-election, and Andrew Jackson is running against him. This is when you have Jackson begin to run as the first Democrat, and we're going to get away from that era of good feelings. So now you have multiple political parties again. You have here a map with the difference between the election of 1824 and your election of 1828. You'll see that Jackson is going to clearly win this one. And a lot of this has to do with the expanded suffrage and the fact that many of your more quote-unquote common citizens, those who do not own property, are now allowed to vote. And that expanded suffrage is going to move Jackson into office. So 3 times as many people are voting in 1828, and Andrew Jackson clearly wins. All right, as president, he's going to become the 7th president of the United States. Remember that his inauguration is a little bit crazy, a little chaotic, and he invites the common citizens and just everyday people out to his inauguration. And you know how some things happen when people are invited places and they don't quite know how to act properly in different settings. And so it becomes a little bit of a mess, and he has to actually be escorted away from the White House. Okay. With Jackson, you're going to have a strengthening in the power of the presidency. He sees the executive branch, or really the president, as your most important elected position, an elected person, and so he's going to act as such. And in doing so, he's going to take on many opponents, and this is where you start to have that question of whether or not Andrew Jackson is acting as a king or as a tyrant, because he's going to go much farther than presidents before him. All right, so be mindful that Andrew Jackson is going to go against Native Americans. He's going to have to deal with the tariff issues. He's dealing with the expansion of the United States. So there are a lot of things that are coming to a head during Jackson's presidency. All right, so against the bureaucracy, remember that Jackson does not trust the establishment. He doesn't trust the people in DC. He doesn't trust the bank. He is going to have a lot of trust issues. So, against the bureaucracy or the established people who are in DC and elected office, he's going to fire most of them. Okay? Like, you've got to go. And he replaces them with his supporters. And rewarding his campaign supporters with jobs becomes known as the spoils system. Might sound a little familiar to what happened to him with the whole corrupt bargain situation with Henry Clay. But Jackson's like, I don't trust these people. I'm going to put my own people into positions. Okay, Jackson against the Native Americans. He is going to pass the Indian Removal Act in 1830 in an attempt to get these Native American groups west of the Mississippi River. This will definitely benefit your farmers, and you also had a little bit of gold found on Cherokee property, and so there's a little miniature gold rush into the state of Georgia. The Indian Removal Act and everything that comes out from that with the Worcester versus Georgia case and Chief Justice John Marshall in the Supreme Court siding with the Native Americans, saying that they can stay on their property, but Jackson ignoring that, and Congress not doing anything about the fact that Jackson's ignoring the Supreme Court, who ultimately decides what laws and actions are constitutional. It's going to eventually lead to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is the route that your 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes are going to take, moving west of the Mississippi River to Oklahoma, which becomes known as Indian Territory, quote-unquote. Now, the Trail of Tears happens after Jackson, but his actions are going to lead us to that particular event, where almost 25% of the Native Americans who take this journey in the winter are going to die from exposure and disease and things of that nature. All right, Jackson against the National Bank. Right, he doesn't trust the bank. He thinks the bank is just a tool of the wealthy. It's just there to help them out. And so he's going to veto the bank's charter. And this is the second bank of the United States. The first bank failed. They reestablished it. You need to renew the charter or the rights of the bank to exist. And Jackson didn't like it. So he's like, no, veto. No, veto. Not going to happen. He begins to place federal money in state banks, which become known as pet banks, and they're particularly in some of your western states. And this causes the Panic of 1837. Like in many situations where the economic crisis begins during one presidency, but it actually comes to a full head in the next presidency, Van Buren's going to be the one that's blamed for the depression that the United States faces. But it all falls back on Jackson's actions here in having the bank fail on purpose. All right, and then Jackson with nullification. Remember, South Carolina doesn't like the federal tariff of 1832. Remember, tariff is a tax on imported goods, and the North is in favor of tariffs because it protects American industry and manufacturing. The South is very much opposed to tariffs. They want them to be low or practically non existent because they rely on credit with the European powers that they trade with. So, South Carolina's extremely upset. Andrew Jackson's vice president is John C. Calhoun. He's beyond upset. And he claims that states can nullify or cancel a law that they believe to be unconstitutional and not follow it in their particular state. This brings up issues of states' rights that will ultimately lead us to the Civil War. But in this particular instance, South Carolina is going to threaten to secede or leave the Union, and Jackson is going to threaten to send military force in order to make sure that he can collect the tariff and make sure that South Carolina remains a part of the Union. South Carolina ultimately does not secede. They do not have support from the other southern states, but be mindful of this and this whole doctrine of nullification and the idea of secession, because South Carolina is going to come back into play when it comes to secession, leading us to the Civil War. Okay, Jackson's legacy. Remember that he is going to be the creator of the modern Democratic Party. With his elections, you have the beginning of new or modernized campaign strategies with parades, rallies, shaking hands, kissing babies, making sure you're out there amongst the people, getting to know them and getting them behind you in order to be elected into office. You also have the protection of popular democracy, the expansion of suffrage, particularly white male suffrage at this point, and he expands the use of the presidential veto because, he doesn't like certain things, so veto. Okay, we're not going to do the exit ticket part. Make sure that as you are reviewing for your tests that you are being mindful of the election of 1824 and how it plays out, the election of 1828, and that expanded suffrage is what leads to Jackson becoming the president. Make sure you look over your cartoons, that cartoon packet of the King Andrew cartoon, your spoil system cartoons, all those things, and you're familiar and comfortable with them. With Native American relations, make sure you take special attention to the Indian Removal Act. That then leads to the Worcester versus Georgia case, what the outcome of that case is, and then what Jackson's response to that case is. Also, with the nullification crisis, remember your tariff of abominations, which was 1828, and then your doctrine of nullification, and how you have all of these tariffs coming about, including Henry Clay's compromise tariff, and all those things that still have South Carolina upset to the point of threatening secession. And then again, what is the impact there, and what is Jackson's response? Also, take special note of the Hayne debate and how it has to deal with the issue of states' rights and the sale of Western land, and how that also is included in the whole nullification crisis and the doctrine of nullification. Remember also that after Jackson is out of office, or really while he's still in office, you have the rise of the next political party, which will be your Whig Party. And that is, again, in reaction to Jackson and his actions in his administration. If you have any questions, always, you can email or come in for tutorials. And I hope this review helps.